The chandelier light splintered across the polished mahogany table like fragments of sunlight on water. JD Vance adjusted his tie, feeling the smooth silk slide between his fingers as he studied the faces staring back at him. Six tech CEOs, each worth more than the GDP of small nations, sat in perfect symmetry on the opposite side. Their expressions, practiced, polished, neutral, revealed nothing. The hearing room of the Russell Senate office building hummed with nervous energy, camera shutters clicking like mechanical insects, the faint scent of expensive cologne and coffee lingering in the air-conditioned chill. This wasn't Vance's first rodeo with big tech, but today felt different. The weight of what he planned to say sat heavy in his chest, a speech he'd rehearsed a dozen times in the mirror that morning, watching his own reflection for signs of doubt. The committee chairman cleared his throat. "Senator Vance, you have 15 minutes for questioning." Vance nodded, leaning toward the microphone. The room settled into an expectant hush. If you're enjoying this breakdown of what's becoming one of the most talked about congressional hearings of the year, take a quick second to hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to see how this confrontation ends, and we've got plenty more political analysis coming your way that cuts through the usual noise. Now back to the Senate chamber, where things were about to get interesting. The CEOs shifted in their seats, leather chairs creaking softly. They'd been through this dance before. The grandstanding, the pointed questions, the carefully crafted non-answers. Their legal teams had prepped them for hours. PowerPoint slides detailing every possible line of questioning. They were ready, or so they thought. Kara Jensen, CEO of World Connect, adjusted her glasses, a nervous tic she'd developed after taking over the social media giant 3 years ago. Next to her, Marcus Reed of Technova scrolled through his notes on a paper-thin tablet, his fingers leaving slight smudges on the screen. The others, Sophia Chen of Datasphere, Robert Wilson of SearchPrime, Eric Noble of Stream Vista, and Tom Lawrence of Megashop, sat with practiced stillness, their shoulders straight, hands folded neatly on the table. "Thank you all for being here today," Vance began, his voice steady and measured. The microphone carried it across the chamber, bouncing off marble columns and wood paneling. "I want to start by acknowledging something we don't usually acknowledge in these hearings." The CEOs exchanged subtle glances. This wasn't the standard opening. "Each of you has built something remarkable," Vance continued. "Companies that have changed how we communicate, shop, learn, and connect. That's the American dream, isn't it? To build something from nothing, to innovate, to succeed." Robert Wilson of SearchPrime nodded slightly, his posture relaxing by a fraction of an inch. This was unexpected praise. Maybe this hearing would be different. But then Vance's tone shifted, almost imperceptibly. "The problem isn't your success. The problem is what that success has cost the rest of America." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. A Senate aide in the back straightened in her chair, sensing the shift. "Let me tell you about Middletown, Ohio," Vance said, setting aside his notes. "The town where I grew up. When I was a kid, we had manufacturing jobs, union jobs, jobs that let people without fancy degrees buy homes, raise families, build communities." Tom Lawrence of Megashop shifted uncomfortably. His company had been criticized for warehouse working conditions and the automation that threatened thousands of retail jobs. "Today," Vance continued, "those jobs are gone. And what's replaced them? Gig work, contract positions, people delivering packages for your companies, driving for your apps, moderating your content, all without benefits, job security, or a living wage." Eric Noble of Stream Vista frowned slightly. His platform relied heavily on independent content creators and contracted developers. "Meanwhile," Vance leaned forward, "your companies have amassed wealth that would make the robber barons of the Gilded Age blush. And you've done it while paying effectively lower tax rates than the teachers who educated you, the nurses who care for your employees, and the police who protect your campuses." The CEOs' faces remained impassive, but their body language told a different story. Kara Jensen's fingers tapped a silent rhythm on the table. Marcus Reed's jaw tightened. Sophia Chen's breathing became more deliberate, controlled. A staffer walked quickly to the chairman, whispering something in his ear. The chairman nodded, glancing at his watch. Time was ticking. Vance noticed the exchange but continued. Last month, I visited a town in rural Pennsylvania, met a man named Michael Grayson, 57 years old, worked in manufacturing for 30 years until his plant closed. Now he delivers food for one of your apps, makes less than minimum wage after expenses, can't afford health insurance. The room was completely still now. Even the journalists had stopped typing, their fingers hovering above keyboards. Michael told me something I can't shake. He said, "Tell those tech people I don't hate them for being successful. I hate that they've forgotten people like me exist." Sophia Chen looked down at her hands, her perfectly manicured nails pressing against her palms. "And here's what bothers me," Vance continued, his voice dropping slightly, forcing everyone to lean in. "I don't think you've forgotten. I think you've chosen not to see." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. A photographer captured the moment. 6 tech titans on one side, a single senator on the other, the power dynamic visibly shifting. Marcus Reed of Technova cleared his throat. "Senator, with all due respect, our companies have created millions of jobs and—" "Created millions of jobs," Vance interrupted, "and destroyed millions of others. The question isn't whether you've created jobs, Mr. Reed. It's whether those jobs allow Americans to live with dignity." Reed's mouth closed, his prepared response suddenly inadequate. Tom Lawrence of Megashop adjusted his tie. "Senator Vance, we operate in a competitive global market. Our responsibility is to our shareholders and—" "To your shareholders," Vance nodded. "That's the problem right there, isn't it? Your responsibility to shareholders above all else, above workers, above communities, above the country that made your success possible." Lawrence blinked rapidly, caught off guard by the directness of the response. The tension in the room was building, layer upon layer, like storm clouds gathering before a downpour. Junior staffers exchanged glances, sensing they were witnessing something unusual. The normal theatrical nature of these hearings had been replaced by something raw, more genuine. "Let me ask you something," Vance said, looking directly at Kara Jensen of World Connect. "Ms. Jensen, your platform has over 3 billion users worldwide. You've testified before that you don't view your company as a publisher, but as a neutral platform. Is that still your position?" Jensen leaned forward, tapping her microphone lightly to ensure it was on. "Yes, Senator. We provide the platform, but our users provide the content. We don't. You don't decide what content succeeds," Vance finished for her. "Except that you do, don't you? Your algorithms decide what content reaches users, what gets amplified, what gets buried." Jensen's professional smile faltered slightly. "Our algorithms are designed to show users content they find engaging, Senator. We don't make editorial decisions," Vance finished again. "And yet, internal documents from your own company, which I have right here," he held up a folder, "show that your teams regularly make decisions about which content to promote and which to suppress." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Jensen's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed as she composed herself. "Senator, without seeing those specific documents, I can't comment." "I understand," Vance nodded. "Let me make it simpler. Yes or no? Does World Connect have the power to influence what topics trend on your platform?" A pause. The room held its breath. "Within certain parameters, yes," Jensen admitted. "And yes or no, has World Connect ever used that power to suppress certain political viewpoints?" Another pause. Longer this time. Jensen glanced quickly at her legal counsel sitting behind her. "Senator, that's a complex question that—" "It's actually not complex at all, Ms. Jensen. It's yes or no." The room was completely silent now. Even the air conditioning seemed to have paused. "I can't speak to every decision made by every team," Jensen said carefully, "but our policies prohibit viewpoint discrimination." Vance nodded slowly, letting her non-answer hang in the air. Then he turned to Robert Wilson of Search Prime. "Mr. Wilson, your search engine processes over 5 billion searches every day. You've stated publicly that your algorithms are neutral. Is that accurate?" Wilson sat up straighter. "Yes, Senator. Our algorithms are designed to provide the most relevant results based on factors your company determines," Vance interjected. "And those factors change regularly, don't they?" Wilson hesitated. "We make improvements to provide better results, yes." "Improvements," Vance repeated. Like when your company demoted certain news sites and search rankings because they were deemed unreliable? Wilson's expression remained neutral, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. We have quality standards for all content, Senator. This isn't about politics, it's absolutely about politics, Mr. Wilson, Vance said, his voice rising slightly. When you decide what information Americans can easily access and what they can't, that's an inherently political act. The room temperature seemed to rise a few degrees. Journalists were typing furiously now, capturing every word. Eric Noble of Stream Vista adjusted his water glass, leaving a ring of condensation on the polished table. His platform had largely escaped scrutiny so far, and he was clearly hoping to keep it that way. But Vance turned to him next. Mr. Noble, your platform recently removed several documentary films about rural poverty in America. Can you explain why? Noble's eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. He hadn't expected this question. Senator, we remove content that violates our community guidelines. Without knowing the specific, I'm referring to Forgotten Counties, An American Crisis, and The Last Factory, Ohio's Struggle. Both award-winning documentaries, both removed from your platform last month. Noble's composure slipped for a moment. He whispered something to an aide behind him, who quickly passed him a note. I'm not familiar with those specific cases, Senator. I'd be happy to look into it and... They were removed, Vance continued, because they featured interviews with voters who expressed views your content moderators flagged as potentially harmful, specifically criticisms of globalization and free trade policies. The gallery erupted in whispers. The committee chairman tapped his gavel lightly, restoring order. Noble's face had lost some of its color. Senator, that doesn't sound consistent with our policies. I would need to... I have the removal notices right here. Vance held up another document, and emails from your content policy team discussing the decision. The air in the room felt electric now. The other CEOs were watching Noble with a mixture of sympathy and relief that they weren't currently in the hot seat. This is what I'm getting at, Vance said, addressing all 6 executives now. You've built systems that determine what Americans see, hear, and ultimately think, yet you claim no responsibility for the consequences. He stood up, an unusual move during questioning that made the CEO sit up straighter. The factories left our towns, the jobs disappeared, communities collapsed, and then you came along, not with new factories or jobs, but with platforms that show people carefully curated versions of reality. Versions that keep them angry, divided, and distracted from the economic forces that actually shape their lives. The accusation landed like a physical blow. Sophia Chen of Datasphere, who had so far escaped direct questioning, looked visibly uncomfortable. Ms. Chen, Vance pivoted unexpectedly, your company collects data on over 200 million Americans. You've stated that this data is anonymized and secure, yet internal documents show your company can identify specific individuals with 97% accuracy based on just 3 data points. Is that correct? Chen's eyes widened slightly. She leaned forward to her microphone. Senator, our data protection protocols are industry-leading and... That wasn't my question, Ms. Chen. Is it possible for your company to identify specific individuals from supposedly anonymized data? Yes or no? Chen swallowed visibly. In certain theoretical scenarios, it might be possible, but... Thank you, Vance cut her off. Now, has your company ever shared this capability with government agencies without a warrant? The question landed like a bombshell. Chen's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Her legal counsel leaned forward, whispering urgently in her ear. I would need to consult with our legal team before answering questions about government partnerships, she finally managed. Vance nodded slowly. I think your non-answer is quite revealing, Ms. Chen. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. The CEOs who had arrived projecting confidence and control now looked increasingly defensive. Their carefully prepared statements seemed inadequate against Vance's direct approach. Then came the moment that would be replayed on news networks for weeks. Vance placed both hands flat on the table before him and leaned forward. His voice was quieter now, but somehow more intense, forcing everyone to listen carefully. Here's what the American people need to understand, he said. These 6 individuals control more of our daily lives than any government agency. They determine what news we see, what products we buy, what opinions we're exposed to. They track our movements, monitor our conversations, analyze our behavior patterns. The CEOs shifted uncomfortably. And they've done all this while telling us they're making the world more open, more connected, more democratic, Vance continued. But the America I see today is more divided, more angry, and more unequal than ever before. He paused, looking each CEO in the eye before delivering his final statement. So here's my question to each of you. At what point did you decide that your algorithms, your profits, and your power were more important than the country that made them possible? The room went completely silent. Not the silence of people waiting for someone to speak, but the heavy silence of a room where something momentous has just occurred, where a question has been asked that no one knows how to answer. For several long seconds, no one moved. The CEOs looked at each other, then down at their notes, then back at Vance. None seemed willing to be the first to speak. Finally, Marcus Reed of Technova cleared his throat. Senator, I think that characterization is unfair. Our companies have created tremendous value and innovation. That value for whom, Mr. Reed? Vance interrupted. For the shareholders? Certainly. For the executives? Absolutely. For the venture capitalists and investment banks? Without question. Reed's confidence faltered. But what about for the truck driver whose job was automated away? For the local newspaper driven out of business by your advertising platforms? For the teenager struggling with depression amplified by your social media algorithms? Vance wasn't shouting. His voice remained measured, almost gentle. But the words landed with the force of truth that couldn't be easily dismissed. Tom Lawrence of Megashop, known for his aggressive responses to criticism, attempted to regain control of the narrative. Senator Vance, with all due respect, you're painting a very one-sided picture. Our company alone employs over 1 million Americans. We've invested billions in this country, built data centers in rural communities, provided opportunities. Mr. Lawrence, Vance cut in, your company reported record profits last quarter. During that same period, you cut health benefits for your warehouse workers and fought unionization efforts in 17 states. Is that correct? Lawrence's face flushed slightly. Business decisions are complex, Senator. We operate in a competitive. It's a yes or no question, Mr. Lawrence. The gallery was completely still, watching the exchange like a high-stakes tennis match. Those specific decisions were made to ensure long-term competitiveness, Lawrence said, avoiding a direct answer. Vance nodded slowly. I'll take that as a yes. He turned to address all 6 executives again. You know, I've been thinking about something my grandmother used to say back in Middletown. She'd tell me, JD, you can judge a person not by what they have, but by what they do with what they have. The CEOs watched him warily, unsure where this was going. Each of you has more power, more wealth, and more influence than almost anyone in human history. The question isn't whether you've been successful. You clearly have. The question is what you've done with that success. Vance paused, letting the words sink in. Have you used it to strengthen the society that made your rise possible? Have you used it to create opportunities for people like the ones you left behind? Have you used it to protect the democratic values that allowed your companies to flourish in the first place? The silence in the room was deafening. Some of the CEOs looked down at the table. Others maintained eye contact, but their expressions had changed. The practiced neutrality had given way to something more complex. Discomfort, perhaps, or recognition. Because from where I'm sitting, Vance continued, it looks like you've used that success to build walls around yourselves. Digital fortresses that protect your power while making it nearly impossible for regular Americans to understand how their lives are being shaped by your decisions. Kara Jensen of World Connect, who had remained composed throughout the hearing, finally spoke up. Senator, I think we all recognize that technology has created both opportunities and challenges. But characterizing us as deliberately undermining American society is what, Ms. Jensen, unfair? Vance asked. Let me ask you this. When was the last time you spoke with someone who lives paycheck to paycheck? When was the last time you visited a town where the main industry shut down? When was the last time you had to worry about making rent or affording health care? Jensen's professional demeanor cracked slightly. My background, I grew up in a middle-class family in Minnesota. My father was a... That's not what I asked, Vance said gently. I asked when was the last time you had meaningful contact with the America that exists outside your company's campus. Jensen fell silent. The question hung in the air. Eric Noble of Stream Vista, perhaps sensing an opportunity to present himself differently, leaned forward. Senator, you make valid points about disconnection. Perhaps instead of just criticism, you could suggest concrete steps we might take to... I'm glad you asked, Mr. Noble, Vance nodded, because that's exactly why we're here. He reached for a document on the table before him. This is the Digital Responsibility Act that I'm introducing next week. It would require your companies to meet 3 basic obligations to the American people. The CEOs tensed visibly. Legislative proposals were always a threat to their business models. First, algorithmic transparency. Americans deserve to know why they see what they see online, why certain voices are amplified and others suppressed. Robert Wilson of Search Prime frowned slightly. Second, data rights. Americans should own their personal data, control how it's used, and share in the profits when it's monetized. Sophia Chen of Datasphere shifted uncomfortably in her seat. And third, economic fairness. If your business model destroys jobs in a community, you should contribute to retraining and reinvestment in that community. Tom Lawrence of Megashop clenched his jaw. This isn't anti-technology legislation, Vance clarified. It's pro-American legislation. It simply asks that the most powerful companies in history acknowledge their responsibility to the society that enabled their success. The committee chairman glanced at his watch. Senator Vance, your time has... I have one final question, Vance said, and something in his tone made the chairman nod in acquiescence. Vance looked at each CEO in turn, his expression not hostile but genuinely curious. The companies you've built have changed the world. No one can deny that. But the question facing us now is whether that change has been for the better, whether the America of 2025 is stronger, fairer, and more united than the America of 2005. He leaned forward slightly. So I'm asking each of you, not as CEOs, but as citizens, are you proud of the country your companies have helped create? The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that fills a room when a truth too uncomfortable to acknowledge has been spoken aloud. None of the CEOs spoke. None of them could, because to answer honestly would require a level of self-reflection and accountability they had carefully avoided for years. After several long seconds, Vance nodded, as if their silence was the only answer he needed. Thank you for your time, he said quietly, gathering his papers. I look forward to working with you or without you to build a tech economy that works for all Americans, not just those fortunate enough to live in your zip codes. As Vance sat back, the hearing room remained unnaturally quiet. Journalists weren't typing, staffers weren't whispering. Even the photographers had momentarily stopped capturing the scene. Something had shifted in the room, and perhaps in the national conversation about technology and power. The usual talking points and corporate deflections had been stripped away, revealing the profound questions that lay beneath. Who benefits from technological progress? Who bears its costs? And who gets to decide? The committee chairman cleared his throat, breaking the spell. We'll take a 15-minute recess, he announced. As the CEOs gathered their papers and whispered to their legal teams, their faces told the story. They had arrived expecting the usual political theater. Grandstanding questions, carefully rehearsed answers, and nothing really changing. Instead, they had faced something they rarely encountered in their carefully controlled lives: accountability. Not from shareholders demanding higher profits or users complaining about features, but from someone asking fundamental questions about their role in American society. Across social media, clips of the exchange were already going viral. Comment sections filled with people saying what many had thought but few had articulated, that something had gone deeply wrong in the relationship between big tech and everyday Americans. As JD Vance left the hearing room, a junior staffer handed him a note. It contained a single sentence. Michael Grayson from Pennsylvania called. He said, "Thank you for remembering he exists." Vance folded the note carefully and put it in his pocket, a small smile crossing his face. In a political era defined by division, he had touched on something that transcended partisan lines: the simple dignity of being seen, of having one's struggles acknowledged by those with the power to address them. Whether his legislation would pass, whether the tech giants would change their practices, whether Americans would demand a different relationship with technology, those questions remained unanswered. But for one remarkable afternoon in Washington, the most powerful business leaders in the world had been rendered speechless by a simple question about their vision for America. And for once, their silence spoke volumes. If you've made it this far, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever felt like modern technology has left you behind? Or has it mostly improved your life? Leave your perspective in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the people and events shaping our future. Until next time, thanks for watching.